It's hard to believe, but these wire spools are one of the longest running forms of recordable audio media ever invented. The wire recorder was invented in 1898, and the technology survived in the 1970s, following with the rise of cheaper quarter-inch and compact cassette tapes. Up until World War II, wire recorders were seen as a sort of novelty. However, their use during the war sparked an increased interest back in the United States and in Europe. Companies began producing larger volumes of recorders, improving the technology, and reducing the cost, allowing for more people to have these in their homes and to make their own recordings and immediately play them back, an experience that was uncommon at the time for most people. The medium became more common in industry as well. Use as a dictation machine was widespread. So too was its use in scientific settings. A psychologist in Chicago, Dr. David Boder, became a major user and proponent of the wire recorder. David Boder had many interests, but his main focus was the study of trauma. Because of this, in 1946, Boder packed up his Pierce wire recorder and headed to Europe, where he spent 3 months interviewing Holocaust survivors. During his trip, he captured, as far as we know, the earliest recorded testimonies of survivors. He came back, wrote a series of books, and after his death in 1961, the spools became lost and forgotten about, much like the medium itself. In the 1990s, most of the spools were rediscovered and subsequently transferred to digital audio tape. The quality of these transfers was generally quite poor, and several of the spools from the Holocaust project were still missing. Eventually, at least one of the missing spools was rediscovered as part of a project to digitize all of the Boder wire spools that reside at the Cummings Center for the History of Psychology. The spool we found has a series of songs sung to Boder at the Henonville Displaced Persons Camp in France. The collection of songs are mostly well-known Jewish folk and religious songs. However, 2 of the songs, Our Camp Stands at the Edge of the Forest and Our Village is Burning, both sung by a young woman named Guta Frank, were of historical note. Our Camp Stands at the Edge of the Forest was the camp song for the Brande forced labor camp. The lyrics were known to scholars, but the melody was not. The other song, Our Village is Burning, had been modified to The Jewish People are Burning and was used as a resistance song in the Krakow ghetto.
Guta Frank singt das Lagerlied zum Brande. Unser Lager steht am Walde des Brandes, an dem Fichtenwald, an dem Fichtenwald. Unser Lager trägt den Namen Brande, und der Name ist so stolz wie der Wald. Es brennt, Brüder, es brennt. In der Urne steht ohne Bier brennt. Bei der Winden in Jagusen reißen, brechen in Seilblusen, fuhren wie die wilde Flammen, als darin Säule brennt.
In the larger picture, we were actively saving history and the voices of Holocaust survivors, history you can hear. Wire as a medium, once common and inexpensive, is now all but lost and forgotten. As a result, so is the content on these spools. At the Cummings Center, we have begun the process of collecting and digitizing wire recordings from people from across the country. We have also begun to create more modern hybrid wire recorders, allowing us to listen to and digitize many different brands and forms of wire spools.
Okay, they may not have known this at the time, but wire is actually one of the most archival forms of media ever. The original wire was a chromium steel alloy, which is very resistant to corrosion. And later wire was actually stainless steel alloy, which is even more resistant to corrosion. The wire suffers from very little magnetic bleed-through when it's wound up on the spools, and properly stored in their canisters, these recordings should last decades beyond even what they have now. So if you're thinking about archiving your vinyl collection onto MP3, you might want to just go to wire instead. Not really. So, however, wire does have its pitfalls as a medium. The wire is extremely thin, and you can see John's pinky, right underneath the wire that's stretched across the head. It travels past the head in the original Pierce wire recorders at 3 feet per second. Later on, in the later recorders, it was standardized to a more 2 feet per second. So if you consider a standard cassette tape, which moves across the playback head at 1 7/8 inches per second, 3 feet per second is considerably fast. So if something happens and the wire comes off the head, or there's another anomaly, if it catches on something, you can wind up with a real mess very quickly. And luckily, this was just a test spool. There was nothing significant on it, and it was played over and over, but eventually that's what happened to it. But even if the wire were to break, you could tie it back together and lose very little information, again, because of its rapid travel speed. In fact, a lot of the canisters had instructions for repairing the wire by actually using a cigarette to anneal the wire and then tying it back together. However, even though the wire itself was very archival, the recording machines themselves were not. The capacitors and the amplifiers would dry out, tubes would go bad. Many of these tubes are obsolete, and they're very difficult to find. Rubber parts will dry out, the rubber tires and rubber wheels. The rubber will dry out and crack and become hard and brittle and slip. And it's very difficult to recoat those with rubber and have it be consistent. The belts also break down and become gooey. And because a lot of our modern recording technology doesn't use belts, replacement belts of the right size are extremely difficult to find. Even the motors, the motor in the Pierce wire recorders, for instance, was press fit together, and it'd be very, very difficult to clean out those bearings and relubricate them because you'd have to cut it apart. So what I decided to do is completely scrap the original amplifier and go with a modern op-amp-based low-noise preamplifier that's connected directly to the head. And the output from the machine now is line level, so it can be fed directly into a computer, where digitizing software can be used to very cleanly capture the sound. The drive mechanism that I use now for this machine no longer uses idler tires and redundant pulleys for things, but it's very simple now. It uses a DC motor that's coupled directly to the pulley that's connected to the spindle for the wire spool. And it's coupled with a single belt, and the motor itself is speed regulated. So it's very stable compared to what it used to be. But we can also adjust the speed to accommodate recordings that may have been recorded at a different rate when they're done. And we did run into that unexpected. So I'm going to continue on, and John is going to finish up this video.
To me, the ultimate importance lies in bringing back the voices, stories, and names of these people. Voices, stories, and names that otherwise would continue to sit unheard and unknown. Voices such as Guta Frank's. Most of what we find on these spools may seem mundane. A man named Donnie Lee telling jokes and practicing singing songs. But when the story is unpacked, it is anything but mundane. The man was in the military during World War II. He was an entertainer and a stand-up comedian during that time. The man died in the mid-1960s, and for the first time since then, his family in Cleveland can hear his voice and hear his jokes again.
This morning I woke up with a sore throat. Didn't know anybody in town, except Hank. I said, Hank, you know a good doctor in town? He said, yeah, I know a real good guy. I said, how do you know he's good? He said he kept a lot of guys out of the Army. So I went up to the doctor's office, knocked on the door. Doctor opened the door. I said, are you Dr. Wasserman? He said, I'm positive. I said, I came for my throat. He said, it's not ready yet. Come back Thursday.
Another portion of our Boater wire spool collection are about 20 hours of therapy sessions between Dr. Boder and a young woman named Cynthia in 1951. In the end, we were able to figure out who she was through some clues in the materials, and came to find that 2 years after the recordings, she was institutionalized. We managed to reach out to her great niece and give her copies of the recordings. She filled in the rest of the story. Her great aunt was institutionalized after being diagnosed schizophrenic, experienced electroshock therapy, and spent the majority of her life in different institutions and hospitals. Through these recordings, Cynthia's great niece gets to know this person she barely remembered from childhood and give her an insight into who she was as a person, her hopes and her dreams, things that otherwise would be gone forever.
I know why I rebel against religion. I know why I went to work for the Defender, because I felt that was my battle, and it was. When I went to work for a colored newspaper, I associated myself with people who were pushed around.
No one knew that these recordings existed, not even her family. And despite her story not being a happy one, it is one that deserves to be remembered. In this preservation project, not everything will be lost songs from the Holocaust, but every single spool holds a story that's been left behind on stainless steel wire for decades. Some will be historically significant. Some will simply be a voice from the past, telling jokes or reading a book. But all of these are just waiting for the day that they can be heard again and help inform us about our own past and our own humanity.
So as part of this initiative, we're looking for more voices from the past so that we can tell their stories. So if you have any wire recordings sitting around, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.